Have you ever stopped and asked yourself what it really looked like, what it felt like when black people in the 1960s reached for whatever they had just to defend themselves, just to survive another night in a country that insisted they shouldn't? Today, we'll explore 25 weapons that never failed them. The first one that always hits you is the .357 Magnum revolver. You've seen it in pictures before. Long steel nose, heavy but steady, the kind of weight that sits cold in the palm. You imagine the click as someone in Oakland, maybe a young panther on patrol, checks the cylinder before sliding it back into a holster. In its original context, it wasn't about swagger, it was a shield, a public declaration in a time when the law treated black people like intruders on their own streets. Today, you're used to seeing police body cams and cell phone footage replayed endlessly, but back then, all they had was presence, a visible warning, "We see you too," and it makes you wonder, if you had been walking behind them during those tense nights, would the sight of that steel have made you feel safer or more afraid? Then there's the .45 caliber pistol. Compact, heavy, powerful. You can feel its dense, centered weight just imagining it. The way the metal warms slightly from body heat when tucked close against the ribs or pressed into a waistband. The M1911, designed for war, finding its second life on American streets. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, enough stopping power to end an argument before it started. Panthers in Oakland carried them openly while monitoring police stops. The pistols visible in holsters or held at their sides, legal and deliberate. They'd quote California law word for word if an officer stepped too close. Penal Code 12031, the right to carry a loaded firearm in public as long as it wasn't concealed. Officers weren't used to citizens who knew the statutes better than they did. In its original context, the .45 wasn't secret. It was almost ceremonial, a way of saying, we're not hiding, we're not running, we're here, and we're watching you. The gun became a form of civic participation, strange as that sounds now. Today, when you see debates online about policing, about body cameras and accountability and reform, you might forget there was a time when communities literally had to stand across the street, armed and watching, just to make sure a single traffic stop didn't turn into a beating, a disappearance, something worse. No footage to upload, no lawyers on speed dial, just presence and firepower and the willingness to use both. And you can't help but wonder, if you had been there, would you have had the nerve to stand in silence, pistol visible, and stare the police down? Another one you remember from photographs is the M1 carbine. Just hearing the name takes you back to that famous ebony photo of Malcolm X peeking out the window, the rifle across his chest like a father guarding his children. You imagine your fingers wrapping around the wooden stock, smooth but worn, smelling faint traces of oil and dust. This rifle was light, semi-automatic, something volunteers could handle even after long days registering voters in Mississippi. Shots rang louder in those flat open fields. The echoes bounced off the tree line, and today, with every documentary and classroom lesson, the M1 seems iconic, but back then it wasn't about symbolism. It was about living long enough to see the sun rise again. So you ask yourself, would you have slept with it by your bed too? The 30-30 lever action rifle is another you might picture resting above a mantle in a small wooden house. Maybe you've seen one before. Smooth lever, long barrel, the smell of oiled metal and old wood blending together. Fannie Lou Hamer talked about rifles like this as casually as some people talk about umbrellas. In the original context, these rifles weren't exotic. They were farm tools, everyday companions for rural families who knew a knock at midnight wasn't always friendly. Today, you lock your doors and maybe set an alarm, but imagine living in a place where a rifle wasn't a hobby. It was the line between surviving and being forgotten. And ask yourself, could you have stayed calm while holding that line? And then the Remington 870 pump-action shotgun, the same one you might have seen behind counters at rural gas stations even decades later. You can picture the cool metal, the slight rattle when you give it a quick shake, the reliable slam of the pump snapping forward. Panthers used it because it didn't jam easily, because its power made even the most reckless officer step back. In Louisiana, its presence alone forced the Klan to retreat more times than anyone likes to admit. Today, you're used to thinking of community safety as something handled by the city, by patrol cars, radios, surveillance. But imagine living in a place where the only thing keeping your block safe was a group of neighbors. Holding one of these in the dark, does that image make you feel uneasy or strangely proud? One of the more surprising memories is the Bowie knife. Long blade, almost theatrical. The kind that glints sharply even in weak light. Named for Jim Bowie, carried through a century of American myth before landing here in hands that never asked for legend. When you imagine holding it, you feel that mix of primal fear and control. The handle rough in your palm, the balance point somewhere between threat and reassurance. These weren't display pieces. They were tools with edges honed on whetstones in backyard sheds, blades oiled and wrapped in cloth, tucked into belts or boot sheaths. In the early 1960s, Robert F. Williams and others kept knives like this as a backup during ambushes or when ammunition ran scarce. A last resort that didn't announce itself, didn't require reloading, didn't depend on anything but the arm that held it. Some men carried them alongside pistols. Others carried them instead, unable to afford both. The original context wasn't cinematic. It was improvised survival, the kind where you planned for the moment your gun became useless weight. Today, Bowie knives are sold as camping gear, hunting accessories, collectibles behind glass cases at flea markets, decorative, nostalgic. But picture being in a house where the power has gone out, where the phone line was cut hours ago, listening to movement circling outside, gripping that blade because it's all you had left. The steel cold at first, then warm, then part of you, and ask yourself, could you hold it steady? And then you remember something far less glamorous, the simple baseball bat. You can almost hear the thunk of wood hitting a porch floor, smell the dust rising from a worn down handle, feel the smoothness where palms rubbed it over the years. This wasn't about firearms. This was about what you could grab in a hurry. Deacons used bats to disperse gatherings before violence escalated, a strangely domestic tool in a deadly environment. Today, a baseball bat makes you think of summer games, aluminum bleachers, laughter echoing across a field, but back then, the same bat sat behind a door like a quiet warning. So you wonder, if all you had was a bat between your family and danger, would you still sleep at night? You move through these memories and start to realize something. Not every weapon was made of steel. Some were made of wood, of desperation, of whatever a person could hold. In trembling hands when the night stretched too long. Take the flagpole, for instance. You picture the smooth, splintering wood, the way the pole vibrates slightly when you grip it near the base. You can almost hear the faint clatter when it taps against concrete as someone shifts their stance. In Plaquemine, Louisiana, in '63, black residents carried these not as props, but as shields. Marchers turning the very symbol people tried to beat them with into a staff of resistance. Back then, a flag wasn't just a fabric, it was a contradiction, a promise printed on cloth, defended with a stick. Today, you see flags waved at parades or ball games, and it feels almost impossible to imagine that same pole once swung to hold back a mob. And you ask yourself, if a symbol can become a weapon when stripped of safety, what would you reach for if all you had left was meaning? Then you think of something heavier, the axe handle. You hear the dull thud as it drops from someone's shoulder to the ground, that solid, earthy weight that belongs on a farm. The handle is smooth in the middle from years of labor, but rougher near the ends where sweat never quite softened the wood. In the Mississippi Delta, people kept axe handles by the door the way city folks kept umbrellas, not for chopping wood, but for standing watch. In its original context, the axe handle was the "don't step any closer" warning in places where night riders crept along back roads. Today, it might sit forgotten in a shed, gathering dust, but imagine gripping it with both hands while your heart hammers against your ribs, waiting for sounds outside to fade. And you ask, could you swing it if your life depended on it? And then, unexpectedly, you remember the pipe wrench, cold, greasy metal, teeth carved into the jaw, designed to bite into steel, but just as capable of biting into something else if survival demanded it. You can feel its uneven weight, the heavy top pulling your wrist downward. Panthers in industrial districts carried these when guns would draw too much attention during police-heavy nights. The original context wasn't glamorous, it was practical. A tool workers already had, a tool nobody questioned until someone needed it. Today, a wrench sits quietly in your toolbox, waiting for a leaky pipe. But back then, imagine using it not to fix something, but to keep something from breaking entirely. Your body, your spirit, your community. And you can't help but wonder, does toughness change when the world forces it on you? Then there's the brick, the simplest, most universal object of all. Feel its grainy surface scraping your fingertips, the dusty red grit clinging to your palms. Imagine the weight, heavier than you expect, like a small promise of force. When tensions exploded in Watts in '65, bricks littered the streets, pulled from crumbling buildings or loose sidewalks. They weren't weapons of choice, they were weapons of necessity. The original context was chaos, frustration finally spilling out after generations of being ignored. Today, bricks build patios and storefronts, transforming neighborhoods. But picture the moment when a brick wasn't part of a building. It was all you had left to protect yourself. And then ask yourself, what would you grab if you could grab nothing else? Next comes the chain, and you can almost hear it before you see it. That metallic rattle as links slide over each other, the cold bite of steel warming slowly in your hand. These chains came off motorcycles, tractors, garages, boat trailers, swing sets, whatever people had lying around. Heavy-duty logging chains from the paper mills, lighter bicycle chains doubled over for speed, tow chains with links thick as thumbs. In Bogalusa, some deacons kept chains wrapped around their wrists like brutal jewelry, ready to uncoil and swing them in a single fluid motion. Flexible armor that could crack bone or deflect a blade. Others stuffed them in coat pockets, the weight pulling fabric down on one side. A quiet announcement to anyone paying attention. A chain requires no ammunition, no maintenance, no permit. It doesn't jam. It doesn't misfire. It makes a sound that travels through walls and settles in the stomach of anyone listening. In its original context, a chain wasn't meant to be elegant. It was meant to be enough. Today, chains lock bikes to posts, secure gates, hang in neat coils at hardware stores with price tags and barcodes. Ordinary objects in ordinary places. But imagine holding one in the dark, the links pooled heavy in your palm, waiting, listening to footsteps you couldn't quite trust, footsteps that might belong to a neighbor or might not. The weight of decision literal in your grip, and ask yourself, would you be able to steady your breathing long enough to swing? Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double check responses. Then the memory grows heavier. The sledgehammer. Thick handle, coarse grain, head solid enough to split stone. You feel the oxybitu's hurt. Slow build in your shoulder, just imagining lifting it. In rural Louisiana, families kept sledgehammers near their front doors, not to attack, but because mobs sometimes tried to batter their way inside. A sledgehammer could break a man's grip on a doorframe or force an intruder backward. The original context was brutal reality. If someone was coming through your door with bad intentions, you met them with whatever could stop them. Today, a sledgehammer is for demolition projects or breaking up old concrete, but imagine hearing pounding on your house from the outside and gripping that handle because calling the police wasn't an option. And you wonder, how long could you hold on before fear made your arms shake? Then you arrive at the machete, long, curved, almost humming when it slices through the air. You can smell the faint tang of metal mixed with dirt and grass, like fields and summer heat trapped on the blade. In Alabama, SNCC allies carried machetes not as weapons, but as tools, clearing brush, cutting paths, staying mobile during freedom work. But the truth is, if danger came, that blade was all they had. In its original context, a machete represented both labor and defense, the line between harvest and harm. Today, it's an outdoor tool, stored in garages or used on hiking trips. But imagine being alone on a rural road, the sun going down, and knowing the only thing standing between you and violence was this thin piece of metal. And you ask, could you move forward anyway? Then there's the crowbar, almost brutish in its simplicity. Cold iron, one hooked end, one flat. You can feel its raw heaviness, the way it strains your forearm when held too long. Panthers used crowbars during police raids, not as weapons, but as survival tools, prying doors open to get children and elders out of gas-filled rooms, smashing padlocks when officers tried to trap people inside. In the original context, the crowbar wasn't about offense, it was about escape. Today, it's something you buy for home projects or emergencies, but imagine clutching it while smoke fills a hallway, your lungs burning, your hands slick with sweat, trying to break a barrier before police break you. And ask yourself, could you work fast enough under pressure? Then you remember the tire iron, something so ordinary you might overlook it. You feel the cold metal as you pull it from a trunk, its three-sided weight shifting in your hand, the smell of rubber and dust lingering in the air. In Mississippi, activists traveled in caravans at night, protecting each other on dark highways. If a car full of strangers tried to force them off the road, the tire iron became an immediate defense, simple, blunt, and already within reach. In its original context, it symbolized readiness, a tool that didn't need to be explained or concealed. Today, it's part of every roadside emergency kit. But imagine gripping it while headlights blind you and engines roar behind you. Would your courage hold long enough to stand firm? And then, unexpectedly tender in its improvisation, the fishing pole, lightweight, flexible, familiar. You imagine the thin whistling sound it makes as it slices the air, the coolness of the handle against your palm, fiberglass or bamboo, meant for catfish and bass, for Sunday afternoons and the slow patience of waiting. These weren't weapons, they were weekend companions, propped in corners of porches, tangled with line and memory. In rural Maryland, during tense nights in Cambridge when Gloria Richardson and others held the line, people grabbed whatever they had, including long fishing poles, to create distance between themselves and aggressors. The pole wasn't meant to harm, it was meant to keep danger at arm's length, then farther. An improvised staff in desperate moments swung in wide arcs to push back anyone who got too close. Reach mattered when you were outnumbered. Reach bought seconds. Seconds bought survival. Today, a fishing pole brings to mind quiet lakes, early mornings, the soft plop of a lure breaking the surface, fathers teaching sons, grandmothers who knew the best spots, the deep stillness of waiting for a bite that might never come. But imagine using that same pole to hold back a crowd pressing toward your door, your hands trembling, your breath short, the rod bending under pressure it was never designed to bear. The thing you associated with peace now, the only barrier between you and harm. harm. And ask yourself, if your calmest tool became your only protection, would you still be able to wield it? Then you return to firearms with the .270 hunting rifle. Long, precise, meant for the stillness of a deer stand. You can feel the smoothness of the stock under your cheek, the cool metal of the barrel nudging your shoulder. In Louisiana, deacons stationed outside town would use rifles like this to watch the horizon, giving warnings when unfamiliar cars approached. The original context wasn't aggression, it was surveillance, vigilance, a way to keep the community one step ahead. Today, you might see such rifles in sporting stores or hunting cabins, but imagine holding one while your breath freezes in your throat and the night around you stays impossibly still. And you wonder, how long could you remain silent in that darkness? As you move deeper into these memories, you start to feel something shift. The weapons become smaller, more intimate. Objects kept close not because they were powerful, but because people needed options. They needed anything that could buy a second, a breath, a chance to reach tomorrow. Think about the Derringer pistol, small enough to disappear inside a pocket or the palm of a hand. You can almost feel its compact frame pressing gently against your skin, metal warming with body heat. The weight is subtle, almost deceptive, like a whisper instead of a shout. In the 1960s, some carried Derringers as backup, tucked quietly beneath layers of fabric because sometimes the loudest protection wasn't the one you displayed, it was the one you kept hidden. In its original context, a Derringer wasn't a primary defense. It was a last resort, a just-in-case that lived in the space between fear and responsibility. Today, it's a collector's piece more than anything, a relic of old Western fantasies. But imagine yourself walking down a dark road, hearing footsteps behind you that refuse to fade. Would the thought of a quiet backup feel comforting or terrifying? Then there's the slingshot, and suddenly you're brought back to a childhood you might not even have lived. The stretchy pull of the band between your fingers, the sharp snap when it releases, the small stone whizzing through the air faster than you expect. In urban uprisings like Detroit in '67, kids, some barely teenagers, used slingshots not to destroy, but to distract, to create distance, to protect the people in their neighborhoods. The original context wasn't warfare, it was improvisation. It was young people trying to defend their block when adults were overwhelmed. Today, a slingshot is a toy in a camping section, but imagine being 13, standing on a rooftop, watching your neighborhood tear itself open and gripping that tiny Y-shaped frame like it was your only contribution to safety. And ask yourself, what would you have done at that age? Then you recall something chemical, improvised, the early form of pepper spray. Though it wasn't called that yet, you imagine the scent of harsh cleaners, ammonia-like sting biting into your nose, the sharp burn in your throat from even a tiny whiff. People mixed household substances into makeshift irritants, not because they wanted to harm anyone, but because non-lethal options were rare. In 1960s urban skirmishes, a glass bottle with a small hole or a spray top became a cloud of self-preservation. The original context was desperation filtered through creativity, resistance shaped by whatever was under the kitchen sink. Today, pepper spray comes neatly packaged, labeled legal. But picture needing to protect yourself with something you mixed alone in a dimly lit kitchen, hands shaking, praying it worked. And you ask yourself, how resourceful would you have been under pressure? And then comes the one people whisper about even today, the Molotov cocktail. You picture the slick glass of a bottle in your hand, the faint slosh of gasoline inside, the crude cloth wick stuffed in the neck. It's frightening even to imagine. In places like Selma after Bloody Sunday, some resorted to these only when terror escalated beyond anything rational. They weren't used casually. They were used when people felt cornered, when every other door to safety had been slammed shut. The original context was raw survival, the darkest edge of resistance. Today, you hear the term in news reports from distant conflicts, far removed from daily life. But imagine standing in the deep quiet of a rural road, palms sweating around glass you didn't want to use, adrenaline surging, your mind screaming that you had no other choice. Could you bear the weight of that moment? You pause. Because every one of these stories, every object, they make something inside you tighten. They remind you that the 1960s weren't just sepia-toned documentaries or history book paragraphs. They were lived, breath by people who wanted nothing more exotic than safety. But the list isn't over, because every time oppression closed one pathway, communities carved out another. Take the flashlight, heavy, metal, old school, the kind people forget belongs on this list. You can feel the cold, cylindrical body in your hand, the ridged grip along the sides, the hard click of that stubborn switch. Those older flashlights were built like clubs, solid enough to knock on doors, signal neighbors, or in emergencies, defend against close-range threats. In the 1960s, they weren't just for light, they were carried on night patrols throughout neighborhoods in Mississippi and Louisiana. The original context mixed utility with necessity. Today, flashlights are lightweight plastic, rechargeable, rechargeable. But picture standing on your porch with one of those older models, scanning the road, hearing your breath echo inside your own ears. Would holding it have steadied your hands? Then there's the car jack handle, another tool people rarely think of. You can imagine its long, narrow metal frame, cool and slightly greasy from living in car trunks. In the Midwest and South, activists traveling in groups would grab jack handles when cars pulled up too close at night. They weren't glamorous, they were practical, reachable in a heartbeat. The original context was mobility and vulnerability. Roads were dangerous for anyone fighting for change. Today, roadside assistance is a phone call away, but picture yourself stranded in 1964 on a dark highway, dust in the air, no streetlights, no safety net, just this simple bar of metal in your hand. How tightly would you have gripped it? Then you return to something deeply human, the hands and fists people used when they had absolutely nothing else. You imagine the trembling energy in your arms, the way your heartbeat thuds through your wrists, the burn in your shoulders as adrenaline fires through your veins. In marches, sit-ins, and nighttime confrontations, many fought with nothing but the body they were born with. The original context wasn't bravado, it was necessity. A fist was the line between pushing forward and falling apart. Today, arguments happen on screens, behind keyboards. But imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers turned family, knowing that if trouble started, you had only your own strength. And ask yourself, how brave could you be with nothing but your own skin for armor? Now imagine yourself standing there in that decade, 1963, 1964, 1965. Depending on where you place your memory, imagine hearing shoes crunch on gravel, dogs barking in the distance, the faint rumble of a car that doesn't belong. Imagine feeling a knot tighten in your chest as you step toward the door because someone in your home is counting on you. What would you reach for? The shotgun leaning against the wall, the chair you shoved under the doorknob, the slingshot your younger brother kept in his pocket, the flashlight you held while checking the yard, your own voice raised in warning? What would you choose? And what would that choice say about you? Because deep down, the question isn't about weapons at all. It's about whether you would have had the strength to stand up in a time when standing up could cost everything. And here's the part that always catches you unexpectedly. When you look at this list, 25 tools, 25 memories, you're not just thinking about the past, you're thinking about resilience, about community, about how people survive when the world insists they shouldn't. These objects aren't relics, they're lessons. And as you sit with them, the weight, the texture, the purpose of each one, you start to feel like you're not just listening to history, you're remembering something ancient inside yourself, something about protection and pride and lineage. You're remembering the quiet, stubborn glow of survival. And that is why this story matters. Now, before you go, I want to ask you something, because stories like these only stay alive when you breathe life back into them. Which of these memories hit you the hardest? Was it the cold heaviness of the 357, the improvised sting of homemade pepper spray, the trembling courage of a child with a slingshot, or the porch light left on for strangers? Tell me in the comments. Share the memory or the feeling or the question that stayed with you, because somebody else scrolling through might need to see that they're not the only one thinking about the weight of history. And if you want more stories like this, more half-remembered truths that slip between the cracks of textbooks, make sure you like the video and subscribe. There are so many more memories waiting to be brought back into the light, and I want you there with me for every one of them. After all, history doesn't survive by accident. It survives because people like you choose to remember.